Hello and welcome back. Well, it's been a busy few weeks with new releases from Photoshop and Lightroom with new features and new AI technology built in, and we'll have a look at those in an upcoming video. But in this video we're going to take a look back at a problem I identified a little while ago, and that is the disconnect between Photoshop and Lightroom, and where our images, when we save them out of Photoshop, do not go back into the right locations in Lightroom. And no, they haven't fixed this yet, but there is a bit of a workaround, and this is what I'm going to demonstrate in this short video. And in upcoming videos we're going to take a look at some of the new third-party software, in particular Topaz Photo AI, which is an interesting new addition to the Topaz suite, and we'll have a look and see whether that works better than using the other components on their own. But let's get started now and look at the problem with Photoshop and Lightroom. So here we are in Lightroom, and I've put a number of images from a random number of different folders into a collection. So let's just take this image and open it in Photoshop, edit in Photoshop, and you'll see that we're using the latest version of Photoshop 2023, and this will open in Photoshop, and here we have the image. Now let's do something really simple with it. I'm just going to apply a hue saturation adjustment, change the hue so that we get quite a different look to our image. And now if I go to File, Save As, Photoshop doesn't know which folder. That's not the source folder. I can rename my file here, and it will be saved as a Photoshop, and the same thing works for a TIFF file, but it doesn't go back into the correct folder. So let's just try and work out what to do about this. So let's cancel out of that. So the solution to this problem is not to use File Save As, if at all possible. If we just take this image now and just click on File Save, the file gets saved, and let's go back to our catalog. This is our collection. You'll see that it has appeared in the collection. We haven't been able to rename it, but if I was to go back to the source folder, let's go back here now. Here's my source folder. Yes, it's also appeared there, obviously, because the collection is really only a reference back to the source folder. So here's our image. We can just go back and look at it in the collection. That's all fine. But the problem is I wanted to rename this file and give it some file name that means something. So the solution to this is to go into our library section of Lightroom, select the folder, the image that we want to rename, and if we go down on the right hand side into the metadata panel, you'll see here's the file name, and I'm going to give this a new name. I'll call it Red Bird just for the sake of it, and now it is renamed in the collection and also obviously in the original source file. But if I go back to Photoshop and I've still got this file open, it's been saved with this name. So let's close that now. And if I was in Photoshop and I wanted to reopen my last used image, which was this one, it can't find it because I've renamed it in Lightroom. So we can't go back to it that way, but we can go back into our Lightroom catalog and pick up the file and re-edit it. So we can just go back into Photoshop, and of course once it becomes a Photoshop file, you always want to continue editing the original file. So here we have this, and we can do something entirely different. Let's just say, instead of being red, let's make it purple. And if we now, obviously we just do File Save because it's already a Photoshop file with a new name, and it will save and appear back in the Lightroom catalog. So far so good. But what happens if I wanted to make a couple of different versions of this file for comparison and to maybe put together as a panel of work or whatever? So let's just do something a little bit different with this one now, and let's apply a curves adjustment, make it much darker and contrasty. That's pretty horrible. And let's also do something a little bit different so we can really see the difference on this. This will be a really green version. So now I want to save this as a file called green version. Now if I just do File Save, I'm going to overwrite my previous file. So this is where I have to go into File Save As, and the problem being that it would probably go to the wrong folder. In this instance, it has actually found the right folder because this is the last folder I used. I'm going to call it Greenbird, just to be really creative with my titles. And so now I'm saving that out, and let's see what happens when we go back to Lightroom and see what's happened. Well, I'm in the collection. Hasn't appeared back in the collection. Let's go back to the source folder in the library. No, it's not there either. And this is where the problem arises again. So we have to now go back. We're in our source folder. We need to go back to the library menu and synchronize the folder. And yes, it knows, it's seen that there's a file there, but we have to synchronize that to bring it in and then manually move that down into my collection, which in this instance is, you'll see I've got quite a few collections going at any one time, and this is my collection, so I manually have to put it back in there. So this is the real problem, and there's no real work around this solution if you want to have multiple versions of a file based on the original. So let's just now have a look at how the naming and the conventions work between Lightroom and Photoshop. So the really annoying thing is that there is communication between Lightroom and Photoshop, because when you export a file from Lightroom, Photoshop knows how you want the file saved. So we're back in Lightroom. Let's go into the Preferences, and we go to the Preferences tab. We go to File Handling. No, we don't go to File Handling. We go to External Editing. And you'll see here that our main external editor is Photoshop, and this is where we determine the color space and the bit depth for the file, and also the resolution. But the important thing is down here is the file naming. Now you can see here that I've got custom settings selected, and let's have a look at those custom settings. And it's going to be, you'll see here, stack with original. That's what I want to do. I want to keep my files saved with the original, and let's just edit that custom setting, and you'll see here that what I've done at the moment is whatever the original file name is, I'm just putting an underscore at the beginning of it, and with the original file name, because I want to always reference my new saved files with the original source file name, so that if I need to go back to the source raw file at any point, I know what file I'm looking for. So that's where Lightroom tells Photoshop how to save the file. And you'll see there also that it's going to be saved back as a Photoshop file, and you can also save it as a TIFF. It doesn't make any real difference. So that's the Lightroom side of things, and it works hand in hand with Photoshop. So if we now look at Photoshop, and if we go into our Edit Preferences section of Photoshop, and you'll see that in this section there's a whole range of different options. What we want to do is the file handling section, and this is where Photoshop should know what it's meant to do when we save a file. And you'll see here that I've ticked a box that says save as to original folder. Well, that just doesn't work, hasn't worked for the last couple of versions. We can save in the background, which enables us to continue editing while the file is saving, and you'll see here that we want to enable the legacy save as. Now, I've tried all of these options with or without these ticked, and it doesn't make any difference. So that's where Photoshop and Lightroom do talk to each other. It's just that when you use the file save as option, it just gets totally confused and does not update Lightroom with the source folder or the collection. But as long as you use file save and then go and rename it as I've demonstrated, it will work. It's just that when you want to make multiple versions, you get into trouble then, because you have to use the file save as option, and it means going around and making sure that you're putting it back into the source folder and then synchronizing it and then bringing it back into any collection. So that's about where we get to working in the conventional way between Lightroom and Photoshop. And you can see that using the save as command is fraught with problems, and you're likely to get yourself tied in knots. But there is another way that we can work around that, and that just depends on how you like to work with your files and whether you want to keep your previous editing available for making multiple versions. So let's now pop back into Lightroom and let's have a look. Here we have our couple of different options that we've saved, and let's say I want to make another version of this one that I've called Redbird. So let's now go into Edit in Photoshop, and we have options available to us. Now normally when you want to re-edit a Photoshop or TIFF file, you always want to edit the original. But in this case we want to maintain that original, and I want to use one of these other two options. Now one of these will work and one of these won't. So let's have a look now at the first option, edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. Now just bear in mind, I have not made any further adjustments to this file in Lightroom, and you should never make further adjustments to a Photoshop or TIFF file in Lightroom. You should always go back into Photoshop and do the editing there, otherwise you'll strike this problem. So let's go and say, okay, we're going to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, and here we are. Now the problem being, I've edited a copy, I no longer have my previous layers available for me to work with. So this is the fundamental problem. If we go back and we've maintained our original layers for future editing, and we go in and edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, you've lost all your layers. Now we can still do further editing, and let's just say we'll make this a monochrome version. So I'm now going to say I'm going to edit this one and save it. So I go into File, Save, and it will save out. You can see that it's now finishing saving. Let's go back to Lightroom, and here we have now. A little bit of a problem is it's gone back into the collection, but it now has the naming convention that I've previously stipulated, which is the original file name with an underscore. And you'll see here that I've got one called Redbird, and my new version is _Redbird. So you're likely to get into trouble with this, but you can go back in here and let's just rename this as we have done previously, and I'll call this monochrome Redbird, and you'll see now that it's monochrome Redbird, and the original file name has been appended with a different version number. But for all intents and purposes, we've now re-edited a different version. So that's not so bad. The problem being, if we edit this way, we lose our original layers. We can't go back and re-edit. But there is a third way. So let's go back to our original saved version, Redbird, edit in Photoshop, and yes, this time we're going to edit a copy. So it's a copy of the original file, and bearing in mind that because we don't make any changes in Lightroom, we don't have to worry about Lightroom changes being available. So let's just go in, edit that file. I'm going to update that file. And here we are. I have another version of my Redbird file, and you'll see that with this version I've got my original layers available, so I can then re-edit what I did previously. And if I wanted to change this to, let's just say, try to find some different coloring, well, let's call this one an aqua version. So I'm going to save this file, save. I do have my original layers available, so I can edit this, and let's go back and see what happens back in Lightroom. Okay, so now I'm again got a new file with the underscore at the beginning, but it has put it back into the collection, and it will obviously appear in the original source folder. So again, I have to go back and rename. We'll call this one the Aqua Bird. And so we're fine. We've got all of our versions available. The only problem being, you need to remember that each time you save out that copy, you need to then rename it once you go back into Lightroom. And this will work, but you just have to, again, be a little careful about your naming conventions. So let's now, we've got all these versions. I'm in a collection. Let's go back to the folder in the library. And yes, here we are. Here's all my versions. Obviously, the collection is only a reference to the original files that exist in your source folder. So while there is a little bit of a problem between working from Photoshop to Lightroom, if you use the file save as functionality, it just doesn't work. But we can work around with a couple of different options, working from Lightroom back to Photoshop and back again. That will work for you. Now, I hope that's been useful. doesn't look as though Photoshop is going to amend that save as problem anytime soon. So in the meantime, this will get us out of trouble. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.